a werewolf romance written by Olivia Smith. The day they lined us up like cattle at a market, I counted 17 girls in silk and gold. I wore a dress the color of ash, not because I had nothing else, because I had learned long before that morning that being seen was the most dangerous thing a girl like me could do. My sisters had spent 3 weeks preparing for the choosing ceremony, waxing, perfuming, laughing in their mirrors. I had spent those same 3 weeks learning how to disappear, how to stand in a crowd and become part of the wall behind me, how to breathe without taking up space. The Alpha King had not chosen anyone in 4 years. 4 years of silence, 4 years of rumors. Some said he was cursed. Some said he was broken. Some said the beast inside him had swallowed the man completely, and nothing remained but teeth and cold eyes. But when he walked through that door, tall, dark, carrying silence like armor, every girl in that hall leaned forward. Every girl except me. I leaned back, and that was exactly when his eyes found mine. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Learned to Vanish. The morning of the choosing ceremony, my sister Thessaly ate 3 eggs, a bowl of honeyed oats, and half a loaf of warm bread, then complained that her stomach felt hollow. I had not eaten since the previous afternoon. Not because there was no food. There was always food in our house. Our father, Lord Cavendron of the Eastern Ridge, kept a table that groaned under the weight of roasted meat and fresh fruit and thick stews that steamed all the way through winter. He kept that table for his family. And I had learned slowly and painfully over 22 years of living under his roof that the word family in our house had a boundary. And I stood just outside it. My name is Seren. Not a name my father chose. A name my mother whispered to me the night before she disappeared, pressing it into my ear like a secret she didn't want the house to swallow. She was gone by morning, and the name was all I kept of her. That and her eyes. Dark, watchful, always reading the room 3 moves ahead. My sisters had our father's coloring. Gold hair, rose cheeks, the kind of beauty that made men stumble mid-sentence. I had my mother's silence, her stillness, her way of standing in the center of a storm and becoming invisible so the storm forgot to touch her. Thessaly was the eldest. 26, loud, certain of her place in every room she entered. She had been preparing for this, choosing for 2 years, treating it the way generals treat campaigns, with strategy, obsession, and zero mercy for anyone in her way. She had bought 4 gowns from the capital. She had hired a woman from the coast to thread gold wire through her hair. She had memorized 17 things about the Alpha King, his title, his lineage, his war victories, his preferred colors. She recited them at dinner like prayers. Our father listened with pride so thick you could taste it. He believed Thessaly would be chosen. He had organized his entire hope around it. Orin was the middle sister. 24, softer than Thessaly, but with a sharpness she kept just below the surface like a blade wrapped in linen. She had not bought 4 gowns. She had bought one, pale blue, perfectly fitted, devastatingly simple. She understood something Thessaly did not, that the Alpha King had seen every extravagant thing in every grand hall across the continent. Orin planned to be the one quiet, perfect note in a room full of noise. She was not wrong to think this way. She was brilliant, actually. I had always admitted that about her, even when she looked through me like glass. And then there was me, 3rd daughter. Unplanned, our father had once said, not knowing I was behind the pantry door. He said it without cruelty, just the flat, tired way a man states a fact that inconveniences him. I had filed it away next to all the other facts I'd collected over the years. The empty seat at the festival table. The gown that was never commissioned for me. The tutor who came 3 times a week and taught Thessaly and Orin and looked past my doorway as though it led to a cupboard. I was not hated. I want to be clear about that. Hatred requires attention, What I received was something colder, the particular invisibility of a person who exists in a house but does not belong to it. The carriage to the choosing ceremony held 4 seats. My father, Thessaly, Orin, and a 4th seat that was offered to me only because the ceremony required all unmarried daughters of noble houses to attend. My father did not look at me when the footman helped me in. He looked out the window. Orin straightened her gloves. Thessaly reviewed her mental list of the Alpha King's preferences. The horses moved, the wheels turned, and I pressed myself into the corner of that carriage, spine against wood, hands folded, breathing shallow. And I practiced the only skill I had ever truly mastered. I practiced becoming nothing. We arrived at Valehorn Hall as the sun reached its highest point. The building was ancient, black stone carved with wolves mid-howl along every arch, torches burning in the middle of the day because the hall was too deep for sunlight to reach the center. Girls poured in from every direction, silk in every color, perfume so thick the air felt heavy. I counted 43 candidates before I stopped counting. Most were daughters of lords and high merchants. Some had traveled weeks to be here. They stood in clusters, evaluating each other with the particular brutality of women who understand that only one of them will leave with everything. I stood near the back wall. I had chosen my dress that morning from the back of my wardrobe, gray-silver, plain, no embroidery. The kind of dress that makes a woman look like part of the architecture. I had pulled my dark hair back without styling it. No powder on my face, no perfume. I looked exactly like what I had decided to be. Background, furniture, air. The doors at the far end of the hall opened without announcement. No trumpet, no herald. Just the slow, heavy sound of 2 iron doors swinging inward, and then silence so complete that 43 women stopped breathing at the same moment. He walked in alone. Cale Dravenmore, Alpha King of the Northern Pax. 6 feet 4 inches of controlled power moving through a hall like a storm that had learned to walk on 2 legs. Dark hair, a jaw carved from something harder than stone. Eyes the color of a winter lake, gray-blue, deep, and utterly without warmth. He wore no crown. He wore black, always black, they said. His wolf was too dominant for color. Even the fabric of his clothing seemed to pull light inward rather than reflect it. He moved through the room slowly, deliberately, and every girl he passed leaned toward him like flowers tracking the sun. He looked at none of them. He walked the full length of the hall. He passed Thessaly, who had positioned herself perfectly in the center of the room, gold wire catching the torchlight. He passed Orin, who stood with her chin tilted just so, her blue gown a quiet masterpiece. He passed daughters of 4 different noble houses. He passed women who had trained for this moment, the way warriors train for battle. He stopped when he reached the back wall. He stopped directly in front of me. The entire hall went absolutely, catastrophically silent. His winter eyes moved over my face, not with the sweeping assessment he'd given the room, but slowly, carefully. The way a man looks at something he did not expect to find and cannot immediately explain. I did not lean toward him. I did not smile. I pressed my back harder against the wall, and I held my breath, and I thought, with every quiet, practiced, desperate instinct I had, please, don't see me. Please look away. Please. Asterisk. He did not look away. He lifted one hand, broad, scarred across the knuckles, and he pointed directly at me. Not at the room, not at the general space, at me, Seren, the ash-gray dress, the girl who had spent her entire life learning to be invisible. And in a voice that moved through stone and silk and perfume and the shock of 43 women, he said 2 words. That one. Chapter 2. The table that never had my plate. Let me take you back, because the story of that moment, of his hand, his eyes, those 2 words, cannot be understood without first understanding what it cost me to be standing in that hall at all. I was 8 years old the first time I understood what I was in my father's house. It was the festival of First Frost, the midwinter celebration that every noble family in the Eastern Ridge held with great ceremony. Our house was decorated with white candles and pine branches. Cook had made her famous spiced venison. There was mulled wine for the adults, sweetened cider for the children, and in the center of the dining table, a crown of braided bread that my sisters and I had been promised we could tear apart together when the meal ended. Thessaly had talked about that bread crown for a week. Even I, 8 years old and already quieter than most children, had let myself feel something warm and small in my chest about it. The guests arrived at sunset. 12 of my father's allies and their wives settling around the long table with the comfortable authority of people who have always been welcomed. I remember their faces catching the candlelight. I remember the sound of laughter already beginning. I took my usual seat, the one I had always sat in, on the left side of the table, between the second and third candelabra. I unfolded my napkin. I placed it in my lap the way our etiquette tutor had taught Thessaly, and which I had watched and copied without being invited to the lesson. I waited for my plate. Plates came for everyone. My father at the head, richly served. Thessaly beside him, beaming. Orin across from her, precise and pleased. The guests one by one. The plates circled the table like a slow tide coming in. I watched them arrive. I tracked each one. And when the serving was done and the last plate had been set, and the tureen of gravy passed and the conversation swelled and the candles burned and the bread crown sat waiting at the center of the table, I sat before an empty space, no plate, no setting. No one had noticed. I sat there for 7 minutes. I counted, before I understood that no one was going to notice. My father was laughing at something a guest had said. Thessaly was demonstrating something with her hands. The servants had retreated. Everyone was eating. And I was sitting in the middle of a warm, lit, beautiful room with an empty place in front of me. And not one person at that table looked my way long enough to see it. I did not cry. I want you to understand this. I did not cry, and I did not call attention to it, and I did not get up and ask cook for a plate. I sat, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I ate the fact of it instead, swallowed it down the way you swallow something bitter, all at once, without tasting it more than necessary. I had already learned, even at 8, that making yourself smaller was safer than demanding to be seen. After dinner, I slipped away before the bread crown was torn. I ate cold porridge alone in the kitchen later. Cook found me and didn't say anything, just left a slice of the venison on a cloth beside me and went back to her dishes. That slice of venison, left without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without anyone looking at me, was the kindest thing I received that entire winter. I thought about it often in the years that followed, about how kindness, when it came to me, always arrived sideways, always without witnesses, always in the shape of things that required no one to officially declare that I mattered. By the time I was 12, I had learned to eat early, before the family sat down, so that the absence of my plate was never something I had to witness. By 15, I had learned to move through the house along its edges, close to walls, near doorways, never through the center of a room. By 18, I had developed a complete internal system for surviving spaces where I was technically present, but functionally absent. I knew how to make myself unremarkable, how to answer questions with the exact right number of words, enough to satisfy, not enough to be remembered, how to dress so that my appearance registered as acceptable without ever drawing a second glance. I was not unhappy every moment. Let me be fair about that. There were afternoons in the library, alone, where I read until the light changed and something in me felt almost full. There were mornings in the garden, early, before anyone else was awake, where I dug my hands into the earth and felt, for a brief and quiet time, like I belonged to something, even if it was just soil and roots and the private company of growing things. There were moments, small ones, mine. But underneath those moments always, there was the hum of a particular kind of hunger. Not for food, not exactly. A hunger for the basic, ordinary, devastating thing of being known, of having someone look at you, really look, past the surface, past the dress, past the carefully arranged unremarkableness, and say, I see you. You are real. You are here. No one had ever done that. Until a man with winter eyes walked the length of a grand hall and stopped in front of the one person who had spent her whole life making sure he wouldn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, because before I can tell you what happened after he pointed at me, After the hall shattered into gasps, and my sisters' faces went the particular white of women who have just watched something impossible occur, I need to tell you about the 3 weeks before the ceremony. About the hunger I mentioned. The real hunger. The one that went beyond library afternoons and garden mornings. The thing I had done to myself in the months leading up to that day, and why I had done it, and what it had cost me in ways that wouldn't show until much later. Because the girl he pointed at was not the girl I used to be. And the story of how I became her, how I carved myself down to almost nothing. That story matters more than the pointing. It matters more than the hall. It is, in fact, the only story worth telling. And it begins with a mirror, and a decision, and the particular cruelty of believing that the best thing you can do for everyone who doesn't love you is to give them less of you to ignore. Chapter 3. What starving looks like. When no one is watching, the decision did not happen all at once. That is the thing about slow destruction. It never announces itself. It doesn't arrive at your door in the middle of the night, with its true name written across its chest. It comes as something reasonable, something logical, something that sounds in the quiet of your own mind, almost like wisdom. It began 4 months before the choosing ceremony, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Thessaly came home from a fitting and announced that the seamstress had said she had the ideal form for a queen. She said it at dinner, turning the phrase over in her mouth like a sweet she wanted everyone to taste. My father nodded with satisfaction. Orin smiled tightly and said nothing, which was how Orin competed, by refusing to react in ways that could be used against her. I was at the end of the table. I had eaten already earlier, my usual precaution. I was present only because my father had made a new rule that season. All daughters were to sit at dinner whether they ate or not, for the sake of appearances when guests dropped by. I sat. I looked at the bread in the center of the table. I was not particularly hungry. But the thought came anyway, quiet, logical, the voice of a mind that has learned to solve the problem of itself. If I became smaller, there would be less of me to overlook. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded even then. I had enough intelligence to recognize the wrongness in the logic, that shrinking further was not a solution, but an acceleration of the problem. I knew that. And yet the mind, when it has spent 22 years receiving a particular message, you are too much and not enough simultaneously, eventually begins to collaborate with that message, begins to find it more efficient to agree. So I started small, skipped breakfast because I had never really eaten breakfast with the family anyway, ate less at my private early dinners, took smaller portions, told myself I wasn't hungry, which was sometimes true, and sometimes not. The first week felt like discipline. The second week felt like control. And control, for a person who had never controlled a single thing about her place in her own home, felt intoxicating, in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has always been allowed to take up space freely. By the end of the first month, I had lost enough weight that my old dresses hung differently. I noticed it when I dressed one morning, the fabric pooling slightly at my waist where it had once fitted snugly. Something moved in me when I saw it. Not pride exactly. Something quieter and more troubling. Relief. As though I had finally found a way to make the outside of my body match how I had always felt on the inside. Reduced. Manageable. Less likely to inconvenience anyone with the fact of my existence. Orin noticed first, not with concern, with calculation. She looked at me across the hallway one morning, and her eyes moved over my frame the way they always moved over useful information. Quickly, thoroughly, filing it away. "You look tired," she said, which was Orin's way of saying something she had decided not to say more precisely. I said I was fine. She went back to her room. That was the end of it. Thessaly noticed 3 weeks later and said, to no one in particular, that I was fading, and laughed as though this were mildly amusing. A flower going out of season. Nothing significant. My father did not notice. Or if he did not consider it worth mentioning. Which, by that point, I had long since stopped expecting otherwise. The months between that Tuesday dinner and the morning of the choosing ceremony were a slow, careful erosion. I ate enough to function. I want to be honest about that. because this story must be honest, even where honesty is uncomfortable. I did not stop eating entirely, but I ate the way I did everything else in that house, minimally, apologetically, as though I were borrowing space that didn't belong to me and was careful not to take more than could be overlooked. I became thin in the way tall grasses become thin in a dry season, still standing, still present, but hollowed out by something invisible. And alongside the physical hunger, there was its twin, the emotional one. The one I had been carrying since I was 8 years old and sitting in front of an empty plate at a table full of people who loved each other and had simply forgotten to love me. That hunger did not diminish as my body did. If anything, as I made myself physically smaller, the emotional hunger grew larger. As though the less space I took up in the world, the more fiercely the part of me that wanted to matter began to press against the inside of my chest. I dreamed sometimes about being seen. Not in grand ways, not about standing at the center of rooms with eyes upon me. I dreamed small, someone calling my name first instead of last, someone asking what I thought before asking what Thessaly thought, someone noticing, just noticing, that I was cold or tired, or that the book I was reading had made me cry a little in the library when no one was watching. I dreamed about the bread crown from the Festival of First Frost, and in the dream, someone had saved me a piece. I always woke up before I got to eat it. The morning of the choosing ceremony, I stood before my mirror for a long time. The gray-silver dress, the unadorned hair, the face that had always looked more like a question than an answer. Dark eyes too large for comfortable beauty, a mouth that was full but never quite smiled correctly, cheekbones that were now sharp enough that the candlelight caught them in ways they hadn't before. I looked at myself and I performed the familiar mathematics. Too much? Not enough? Too visible? Not visible enough? I settled, as always, on the only calculation I trusted. Less is safer. Smaller is safer. Invisible is safest. I went downstairs. I got into the carriage. I pressed myself into the corner. And I told myself that today, like every day, no one would look at me. I was wrong. For the first time in 22 years, I was catastrophically, completely, life-alteringly wrong. Chapter 4. The Weight of Two Words. The hall had not gone quiet. It had gone hollow, like all the sound had been pulled out through a single point, and that point was me. 43 women. My father. Dozens of lords and guards and attendants lining the walls. All of them looking at the same thing. The Alpha King's extended hand. His finger. The precise, unmistakable direction of his choice. And at the end of that direction, me. Seren. The gray dress. The girl from the corner. I did not move. I was not certain my legs would cooperate if I tried. Cale Dravenmore's arm did not waver. He stood the way mountains stand, with the settled certainty of something that has decided where it belongs, and has no intention of reconsidering. His eyes had not left my face. They were doing that thing again, that slow, deliberate reading, like a man working through a language he recognizes but hasn't spoken in a very long time. It was not comfortable. It was the most uncomfortable thing I had experienced in a life that had given me considerable practice with discomfort. Because discomfort, in my experience, was at least predictable. It occupied familiar shapes. The empty plate, the overlooked chair, the name said last. This was a different shape entirely. This was exposure. This was the terrible opposite of invisibility. This was being seen, and I did not know how to survive it. The first sound to break the silence was Thessaly. She made a noise, not quite a word, not quite a scream, something in between that came from the place where carefully arranged hope meets the wall of its own impossibility. It was, I realized with a detached, almost academic clarity, the sound of everything she had prepared for, and planned for, and positioned herself for over 2 solid years collapsing in the space of 3 seconds. I heard it, and I felt something in my chest, not triumph. I want to be clear about that. Not triumph. Something more like grief, because I had grown up beside that hope of hers, even if she had never included me in it, and watching something that enormous fall was sad, even when you were the reason it fell. Orin made no sound. Orin turned to look at me, and her face, usually so controlled, so perfectly curated, was performing a rapid series of calculations I could almost watch moving behind her eyes. She had not expected this. She had accounted for every competitor in that hall, except the one she had never considered a competitor at all. That, I thought, in the strange floating calm that had settled over me like a layer of cold water, was the most honest thing that had ever happened between us. I had always known she didn't see me. Now I had proof that the blindness was complete. My father was the last person I looked at. He was standing near the front with the other noble lords, and his face was doing something I had never seen it do before. It was confused. Not angry, not calculating. Simply, plainly confused, the way a man is confused when reality insists on something his mind has not left room for. He was looking at me as though I were a piece of furniture that had suddenly stood up and spoken. And somewhere underneath that expression, buried where he probably didn't know it was showing, there was something else. Something that might have been shame, if he had been the kind of man who wore shame openly. He looked away before I could be certain. Step forward. The Alpha King's voice again. Quiet, but with the quality of something that did not need to be loud in order to be absolute. It moved through the hollow hall and landed directly in my chest, pressing against the ribs I could now count through the fabric of my gray dress. I looked at him. He was still looking at me. Still waiting. I stepped forward. My legs worked. That was a surprise. I crossed the distance between the wall and the center of the room on legs that I had not entirely trusted, and the crowd parted ahead of me in the way crowds part for things they don't understand, not with respect, but with the particular instinctive deference to forces that seemed to be operating by different rules than everyone else in the room. I stopped 2 feet from him. He was taller than he had seemed from a distance, which I had not thought possible. He smelled of pine and cold air, and something older underneath, the particular animal warmth of a dominant wolf, which I had read about in books but never encountered, and which was significantly more overwhelming in person than any book had prepared me for. He looked at me without speaking for a moment. I looked back, not because I was brave, but because I had discovered in the last 30 seconds that I appeared to have used all my available fear already, and there was nothing left to power the instinct to look away. "What is your name?" he said. "Seren," I said. My voice was steady. I had no idea how. Something moved across his face, too fast to read. Gone before I could name it. "Seren," he repeated. Not like he was testing the name. Like he had known it before and was confirming it was still there. Behind me, I heard Thessaly begin to cry. Not quietly. The sound filled the hall with a raw, ugly grief that I suspect she would be deeply embarrassed by later, when she had time to calculate what had been witnessed. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the man in front of me who had just done the one thing no one in my entire 22 years of living had done. He had looked at me and chosen me. Not Thessaly, with her gold wire and her careful campaign. Not Orin, with her blue gown and her quiet strategy. Not any of the 43 women who had prepared for this, who had wanted this, who had earned this in every way that preparation and wanting and earning are supposed to matter. Me, unremarkable Seren, the gray dress, the girl who had not eaten a proper meal in 4 months and could feel her own heartbeat in her temples, and whose legs were, she now realized, shaking. Very slightly, but shaking nonetheless. I thought about the bread crown, about the empty plate, about every dinner I had eaten early and alone and sideways, as though even nourishment was something I had to take without being witnessed. I thought about my mother's name, pressed into my ear in the dark. I thought about the garden in the early mornings, and the soil, and the brief private feeling of belonging to something. I thought, he sees me, and I don't know what to do with that. And then one of his guards stepped forward and announced that the choosing was complete, and someone took me gently by the arm, not roughly, not dismissively, but carefully, like I was something that might break, and the hall erupted around me into sound and chaos, and I was led forward through a door I had not noticed before, away from my father and my sisters, and the life I had been carefully invisible inside for 22 years. The door closed behind me, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was alone in a room with someone who had deliberately, publicly, irrevocably chosen to put me there. Chapter 5: What the Alpha King Keeps Behind Stone Walls. The room they brought me to was nothing like what the stories promised. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Alpha King's inner chambers described as a war tent dressed in gold, weapons on every surface, maps covering every wall, the bones of enemies used as decorative elements by men who wrote those stories with the particular enthusiasm of people who had never actually been inside. The room I stood in was none of those things. It was large, yes. High stone ceilings that disappeared into shadow above the torchlight. Windows narrow enough to serve as arrow slits, but positioned to frame specific views of the mountains beyond. A desk that had been used so extensively, its surface had taken on the texture of a living thing. Scarred, stained, warped by years of weight and weather, and decisions made in the middle of sleepless nights. Bookshelves. More than I had expected. Not decorative ones. These had been read, their spines cracked and colored by use, several of them lying open on surfaces throughout the room as though put down mid-thought. A chair pulled close to a fireplace, angled not toward the door, but toward the window, with a blanket over the armrest that was so worn it had gone soft in the way blankets go soft when a person uses them every night over many years without replacing them. This was not a room that performed. This was a room where someone actually lived. I stood near the doorway. The guard who had brought me here had gone. I was alone, or appeared to be, until I became aware of him. He had come in through a different door, one set into the left wall that I hadn't seen, and he stood now near the desk, with his back partially to me, pulling off the dark jacket he'd worn in the hall. Not dramatically, not performatively. The way a man removes his jacket when he comes home. When he turned around, he was in a simpler shirt, dark still, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. He looked, without the formal weight of the ceremony around him, almost like a person. Almost. "Sit," he said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. The tone of a man who has spent so long in command that it has become the shape of his voice, regardless of intent. I sat. The chair was near the fireplace, and I realized as I settled into it that I was colder than I had known. I had been cold for weeks. One of the things I had not acknowledged, the steady chill that had settled into me as my body ran out of reserves to generate warmth. The fire reached toward me, and something in my muscles loosened in response. The way held breath releases. He pulled a chair to face mine and sat without the distance he might have kept with other women. Not close enough to be inappropriate. Close enough to speak without performing. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me in the hall. That careful, unhurried assessment that made me feel simultaneously like a puzzle and an answer. "When did you last eat a full meal?" he said. My stomach dropped. Of all the things I had anticipated him saying, and I had run through approximately 60 possibilities in the corridor, it was not that. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, which was a lie so transparent I was mildly embarrassed by it even as it left my mouth. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A slight tightening, a shadow passing through. "Your hands," he said. "When you stepped forward, you were shaking. Not from fear. Fear shakes differently. Your coloring is wrong. Your movements are careful in the way people move when they're managing pain." He paused. "And you're too thin for your frame. You have good bones. Someone starved them." The word "someone" landed strangely, as though the doing of it had been external, as though the person who had made the decision to eat less and less until the cold was constant and the shaking was only visible when I let my guard down, that person was not sitting in this chair. Maybe he was more right than he knew. "I haven't been very hungry," I said. The second lie was worse than the first. Something shifted in his face. Not anger, not pity. A kind of quiet, contained sorrow, the kind that belongs to a person who recognizes a thing because they have seen it close up before. He stood without speaking, crossed to a side table, and poured something from a covered pot that had been sitting above a warming stone. Broth, the smell hit me even from across the room, rich and bone deep, the kind of smell that reaches past the places where you've been telling yourself you're not hungry and calls directly to the part of you that is. He brought the cup to me and held it out. I looked at it. I looked at him. I was acutely aware in that moment of everything I had not let myself want in 4 months, in 22 years. I was aware of the bread crown and the empty plate and every early dinner eaten sideways and alone, and I was aware of how it felt to be offered something, simply, directly, without ceremony or condition, by someone who had chosen you when they didn't have to. My hands were shaking again. He didn't comment on it. He just held the cup steady until I took it. The first sip hit my stomach like sunlight through cold glass. I did not cry. I was too careful for that, had been too careful for too long. But my eyes stung, and I looked at the fire instead of at him, and I drank the whole cup slowly while he returned to his chair and sat in silence with the kind of patience that does not feel like waiting, but like simply being present without requiring anything from you. When I finished, he said, "There are things we need to discuss, about the choosing, about what it means, about what I know." He paused. "But not tonight. Tonight you eat and you sleep, and we begin properly in the morning." I looked at him. "You speak as though this is certain," I said. "As though I've agreed to something." "Have you not?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. I thought about the carriage, the corner, the gray dress, the 22 years of practicing disappearance and the moment, 47 minutes ago, when the most powerful man in the Northern Pax had looked across a hall full of silk and gold and pointed at the one woman who had decided not to exist. "I don't know what I've agreed to," I said. "That's honest," he said. "I'm not generally given credit for honesty," I said, and was surprised to hear the bitterness in it, clean and sharp, like something that had been sealed for a long time and released without quite intending to. He looked at me carefully. "You will be," he said. "Here." I didn't believe him, but I held the warm cup in my still shaking hands, and I sat beside someone else's fire, and I let myself carefully, like a person testing ice before committing their weight to it, I let myself feel, for just a moment, that being here might not be the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Chapter 6. Everything He Knows. That he shouldn't. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of voices. Not in my room. I had been given a room adjoining the chamber where we had spoken, simple and warm, with a bed that had clean linens and a window that faced the mountains. I had not expected to sleep, but the fire and the broth and the accumulated exhaustion of months of bad nutrition had conspired against my anxiety, and I had been pulled under almost immediately after a quiet meal of bread and soft cheese that a silent attendant had brought without being asked. I slept deeply, without dreams, which was unusual for me. I almost always dreamed. The absence of it felt significant in a way I couldn't quite name. The voices woke me near the second hour of the night, low, controlled, but carrying the particular tension of an argument being kept below a threshold of dignity. I sat up. The fire in my room had banked to coals, but the room was still warm. I listened. 2 voices. One of them his. I recognized the timbre without needing words, that same quality of compressed command. The other voice was lighter, faster, more agitated. Someone who was allowed to be agitated in his presence, which told me immediately that they were either trusted or dangerous, or both. I could not hear the words through the stone, but I could hear the shape of what was happening. One person insisting, one person refusing, and between them the particular charged silence of people who have been having the same argument in different forms for a long time. Then the lighter voice said something that made us go very quiet, and in that quiet I heard my name. Seren, said by someone who knew it before today. I was out of the bed before I had decided to move. The corridor between my room and his was unguarded. He had dismissed his personal guard at some point in the evening, which I stored away as relevant information. I moved along the wall the way I always moved, heel to toe, minimal sound, the particular skill of a person who has spent years navigating occupied houses without being heard. The voices were coming from behind a third door, one I had not noticed before, set into the corridor wall and slightly ajar. I stopped beside it. I did not open it further. I listened. "Cannot be what you think it is," the lighter voice was saying. Male, young, familiar with him in the way that suggests years of proximity. "The timing is too exact. She appears at the choosing. She matches everything. She does not appear," he said. His voice was flat, controlled in the way that things are controlled when the person controlling them is being very deliberate about it. "She was brought. There is a difference. Brought by whom? Her father? That man has not made a useful decision in 20 years. Not her father." Silence. "Then who?" the other voice said. Longer silence. "Kyle. There are things I'm still determining," he said, "and I will not discuss them here, at this hour, when she's 20 feet away." My heart stopped, then started again very fast. He knew I was there. I was certain of it. There was no logical reason to be certain, but I was. The way he had said 20 feet away, not as a general estimate, but with the specific confidence of a man with a wolf's senses who had been tracking my presence since I woke up. I had made no sound. I had moved with every skill I possessed, and he had known anyway. I stepped back from the door, then stopped. Then, because I had spent 22 years moving away from things that scared me, and it had not improved my situation even slightly, I stepped back toward it. "She deserves to know," the other voice said, quieter now. "She deserves to eat a full meal first," he said. "She deserves to sleep without nightmares first. She deserves, Fenric, to have at least one morning in this place where someone asks her what she needs before dumping everything she has no context for onto her lap." The one called Fenric was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like you know her." "I know what was done to her. That's not the same thing." "No," he said, "but it's a beginning." I stood in the dark corridor with my back against the cold stone, and my heart doing something complicated in my chest, and my mind moving very fast through everything I had just heard. She matches everything. He had chosen me not by chance, not by whim, not by whatever mysterious instinct the stories attributed to alpha wolves identifying their mates. He had known something. He had come to that hall already carrying a piece of information about me, and the choosing had been, what? A confirmation? A retrieval? A rescue? The word arrived, and I didn't know what to do with it. I had never been rescued. I was not someone who got rescued. Rescue was for people that others had noticed were in danger, and no one had noticed me in danger because no one had been looking closely enough to see it. And yet, I know what was done to her. Not what she did to herself. What was done to her. As though my 4 months of careful, quiet, reasonable-seeming self-reduction was not a private decision, but a consequence. As though it had a cause outside myself that he had identified and named, and was now, in his measured, deliberate, infuriating way, working backward from. I returned to my room. I lay down. I did not sleep again until nearly dawn. And when I finally did, I dreamed for the first time in months, not about the bread crown, not about the empty plate, but about a hand extended in a room full of noise, and the silence that followed, and 2 words that changed the shape of everything. I dreamed about being pointed at, and in the dream, for the first time, I did not try to become the wall. Chapter 7, What Thessaly Sent, and What It Cost Her. The letter arrived on the 3rd morning. I had been at Veilhorn Hall for 2 days, 2 days of careful, disorienting adjustment to a place that was nothing like the stories, and nothing like home, which made it paradoxically easier to inhabit than either. Kale and I had eaten breakfast together both mornings, a ritual that had established itself without being declared, with a quietness that I was still learning how to read. He spoke when he had something to say. He did not fill silence with noise. This was deeply unfamiliar to me. I had spent my life in a house where silence was uncomfortable, where the people around me talked past and over and through each other in the constant performance of connection. His silence felt different. It felt like a room where something could grow if left undisturbed. I was eating, actually eating, with something approaching genuine appetite for the first time in months, because the food here arrived without the ambient grief of my father's table. and the absence of that grief made the food taste completely different when the attendant brought the sealed letter to my place and set it down without comment. The seal was my father's, but the handwriting was Thessaly's. I recognized it before I turned the letter over. She had a particular way of pressing too hard with the pen, as though the words needed to be kept from escaping. I set down my spoon. I looked at the letter. I was aware, without looking up, that Cale across the table had gone very still in the way he went still when he was paying attention to something he was pretending not to pay attention to. I opened it. Seren, Father says I am not to write to you, so I am writing to you. What happened at the ceremony was a humiliation. Not yours. I understand that you did nothing, or at least I am trying to understand it, and some days I manage better than others. The humiliation was mine, and I have had to sit with it in ways that are not comfortable and that I do not entirely know how to describe. I prepared for 2 years. I was ready. I was the right choice by every measure anyone has ever used to determine such things. And you were chosen. You, who wore gray. You, who have never been. You have never been. She had crossed out the next line several times. Beneath the crossings out, I could still read. The one anyone looked at first. I need you to understand something. I do not write this to hurt you, although I recognize that it may. I write because I have been thinking, for 2 days, about the look on the Alpha King's face when he chose you. I have studied faces my entire life. It is one of the things I am actually quite good at, and I am aware that I do not credit myself well for it. The look on his face was not random. It was not the look of a man making an unexpected decision. It was the look of a man who found what he had been looking for. Which means he was looking. Which means he knew something about you that I, your sister who has lived in the same house with you for 22 years, apparently did not. And that, Seren, that is what I cannot stop thinking about. Not that he chose you instead of me, but that he saw something I missed. I need to know what it was. Not to take it from you, because I need to know what I have been missing. I read the letter twice, then I folded it very carefully and set it on the table. Your sister, Cale said. Thessaly, I said. The eldest. I know who she is, he said. A pause. What does she want? I thought about how to answer that. She wants to know what you saw, I said. He set down his own cup. He looked at me with that Winter Lake directness that I was still, after 2 days, not entirely accustomed to. What do you think I saw? He said. It was a question I had been avoiding asking myself. I had been very busy not asking it, filling the space where the question lived with practical observations about the room, the food, the schedule of this strange new place. I looked at the letter in my hands. I looked at the fire. I thought about 22 years of a particular kind of hunger, and about how hunger, if it goes on long enough, eventually becomes visible, not as weakness, but as a particular quality of stillness, the way the body conserves what the spirit has been denied. I think you saw someone who had been very hungry for a very long time, I said. Something moved across his face. Not pity. Pity would have been unbearable. It was recognition. The specific, private recognition of one person who understands a thing from the inside, looking at another person who also understands it from the inside. It was there for only a moment, and then his expression settled back into its usual controlled plainness. But I had seen it, and I filed it away in the careful library I was building. Things about him that the stories had completely failed to mention. Write back to her, he said. I looked up. What? Write back to Thessaly, he said. Tell her that what I saw was someone who had been taught that being seen was dangerous, and that the most valuable thing in a room full of people performing is the one person who has given up on performance entirely. He paused. Tell her that. She'll understand more from it than you think. I sat with that for a moment. Then, you could have just told me that on the first day. I could have, he agreed. Not apologetically. As a fact. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, not deflecting, the silence of genuine consideration. Because, he said finally, some things have to be received at the right speed. You had enough new information. He looked at me steadily. You still do. I thought about the corridor, about Fenric's voice, I know what was done to her. I thought about asking him directly what he knew and how he knew it. I had been building toward the question for 2 days, testing the ground the way I'd tested ice in the dream, carefully, weight by weight. "You're going to tell me something soon," I said. "Something I'm not going to find easy." His expression didn't change. "Yes." "Is it going to change things?" "Everything," he said. I looked at the letter in my hands. At Thessaly's pressed too hard handwriting, the crossed out line underneath which I could still read, the one anyone looked at first. I thought about how strange it was that my sister, who had looked through me for 22 years, was now writing to me because a man with winter eyes had looked at me, and the looking had been so complete that even she, who had never seen me, had felt its reverberations. I folded the letter again and placed it in my pocket. "When?" I said. "Tonight," he said, and the word landed like the first note of something that had been building for a very long time. Chapter 8. The Truth That Was Buried with My Mother. He told me in the room with the bookshelves and the worn chair and the fire, not across a formal table, not in the hall where power arranged itself into architecture. In the room where he actually lived, because I understood this as he led me there. What he was about to say required the most honest space he had. Fenric was there. Younger than I had imagined from his voice, perhaps 25, with watchful eyes and the kind of face that catalogues everything it sees, without letting on that it's cataloging. He nodded at me when I entered, the nod of someone who has been expecting me for longer than the length of this particular evening. I sat in the worn chair. Kyle stood near the fire. Fenric leaned against the far bookshelf. The room had the quality of a place where a difficult thing was about to be done carefully. "Your mother?" Cale said. Not as a question. My chest tightened. "She left when I was 8, I said. The practiced sentence. The one I had given when occasionally, rarely, someone had thought to ask. "She didn't leave," he said. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved against the narrow windows. "She was taken," Fenric said from the bookshelf. "Removed from your father's house with the cooperation of 2 men on his council, who were in the service of a pack lord from the Western Range named Dial Morsvik. He said the name the way people say names they find personally distasteful. Morsvik believed your mother carried information, specific knowledge about old pack treaties, bloodlines, territorial claims that were legally, but historically significant. He was right. I heard myself say, she was a lord's daughter. She was a keeper, Cale said. Not a title most people know anymore. It's old, older than the current pack structure. Keepers were humans with specific lineage who were entrusted with the records of pack agreements going back 300 years. Oral and written. They memorized them. They carried them. When the keeper died without passing the knowledge formally, it was considered one of the great legal crises of the age. Except most people were never told it was a crisis, because the parties involved had significant incentive to pretend the records had simply been lost. I was very still. My mind was doing the thing it does under extreme information load, going absolutely quiet, sorting, refusing to react until it had processed enough to react accurately. She was taken, I said, carefully. And my father allowed it, Fenric said, not cruelly, just flatly. The way you say something terrible when you have had time to make peace with its terribleness. He did not arrange it, but he was told afterward that your mother had chosen to leave. He accepted that. Possibly because it was easier. Possibly because Morsvik made it worth his while to not ask further questions. The knowledge she carried, Cale said, includes territorial records that directly affect 5 current pack claims, including 2 of mine. He held my eyes as he said it. I have spent 4 years trying to locate what happened to her. 4 years of not choosing anyone at the choosing ceremonies because I was looking for the keeper or her line, or anyone who might carry what she knew. The pieces arrived in my mind in a particular order, the way they always arrive when something is true, not one at a time, but all at once, already assembled, waiting only for you to catch up to the shape of them. 4 years, 4 choosings. She matches everything. The way he had looked at me in the hall, Not like a man seeing a woman. Not only that, but like a man recognizing something that had been lost and was now standing in front of him in a gray dress. "You came for information," I said. My voice was very flat. "I came for justice," he said. The word landed without deflection. "For your mother, for the records she kept. For you, because what was done to your mother was eventually done to you, in the particular way that injustice spreads down through families like water, finding the lowest point. But the choice, the pointing, was that real," he said, firmly, without hesitation. "Do you understand the difference between knowing a person exists and choosing them? I knew you might be at that hall. I did not know what I would find. I did not know," and here something in his voice shifted, the controlled plainness giving way for just a moment to something unscripted. "That you would be standing in the back of that room in a dress the color of surrender, shaking from hunger, and looking at the floor as though looking up might cost you something. I did not know I would need to choose you before I had a single conversation with you." The fire moved. I looked at it. "Where is she?" I said. Silence. "Your mother," Fenric said quietly, "is alive. She is being held in a property belonging to Morsvik in the far western territories. We found her 6 weeks ago." A pause. We were waiting for the right moment to act. Certain legal and territorial claims needed to be in order before we moved, claims that are now significantly strengthened by the fact that the Keeper's daughter is in this house under the protection of the Alpha King. My mother was alive. 22 years. She had been alive for all 22 of them, and I had been in my father's house, learning to eat less and take up less space and breathe apologetically. And she had been alive and taken and held, and I had not known, and my father had not looked, and the world had kept moving with that fact, buried underneath it like a stone at the bottom of a river. I was not going to cry. I had decided this some seconds ago, and the decision held. I pressed my hands flat on my knees, and I breathed, and I felt the thing that was happening in my chest. It was not grief, exactly. It was grief's twin. The particular devastation of hope restored after long absence. Because grief you can manage. Grief has a shape you eventually learn to carry. Hope, after you've given up on it, is almost unbearable in its arrival. It comes in like a wound reopening, not because it hurts, but because the tissue was not ready. "What do you need from me?" I said. Kyle looked at me for a long moment. "Right now?" he said. "Nothing. She is being moved as we speak. She will be here within a week." "And the records she carries?" "We will work through them together," he said. "When she is rested. When you both have time." I sat with all of it, with the weight of 22 years of a lie sitting on my chest, rearranging everything I had understood about my own life, with the knowledge that the gray dress and the back wall and the hunger I had conducted against my own body had a cause, not just the empty plate and the overlooked chair, but something older and more deliberate, a theft so complete it had reshaped an entire household without the household knowing. "She pressed my name into my ear," I said, almost to myself. "The night before she was taken. She called me Seren." "Keeper names," Fenric said softly. "They matter. They carry history." I looked up, at the bookshelves, at the worn chair's blanket, at Kyle, standing near the fire, with his hands at his sides, and his winter eyes watching me with that particular patience that felt not like waiting, but like being present without demanding. "1 week," I said. "1 week," he confirmed. I stood. My legs held. I was becoming accustomed to them holding, even when I expected otherwise. "I need some time," I said. "Of course," he said. I walked to the door, then stopped. Then turned around because I had spent my whole life walking away from difficult things, and I was testing, carefully and deliberately, what happened when I didn't. "The night in the corridor," I said. "You knew I was there." "Yes," he said. "You said what you said anyway." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you needed to hear it before you were ready to hear it from me directly. And some truths," he said, "land better when they're not aimed at you." I stood in the doorway, and I thought about that. About the 22 years of truths that had been aimed past me, around me, over and under me without landing. And the one man who had understood from the beginning that the way to reach someone who had learned to deflect everything was to let the truth arrive sideways. "Good night," I said. "Good night, Seren," he said, and my name, in his voice, in that room, felt like the beginning of being known. Chapter 9. The Night. My mother walked through the door. She arrived on the 7th day, at dusk, in a carriage that bore no markings. I had not allowed myself to count the days. I had told myself, firmly and repeatedly, that counting was a form of attachment to an outcome that might not arrive as promised. That hope, returned after long absence, needed to be held loosely, or it would break something fragile that I was still in the process of rebuilding. So I did not count. I read the books in Cale's shelves, which were remarkable and eclectic, and revealed considerably more about the man than he had disclosed directly. I ate, with growing consistency, the meals that arrived 3 times daily. I walked the grounds in the early mornings, the way I had walked the garden at home, close to the edges, near the walls, and then, slowly, across the middle. I learned the names of the 2 attendants who had been assigned to me. I wrote back to Thessaly. I did not count the days, but I knew on the 7th day, when Fenric appeared in the doorway of the library where I was reading and said simply, "She's here," that some part of me had been counting every single one. I did not run. Running was not something I trusted my legs with in that moment. I walked. Through the corridor and down the stairs and through the great hall, and to the front entrance where the carriage had stopped, and the door was being opened by someone I didn't look at because my eyes had already found the figure stepping down. She was smaller than I remembered. This is the thing they never tell you about reunions with people you have not seen since childhood, that the scale of your memory is warped by the scale you were when you formed it. I had remembered my mother as tall. She was, I now saw, barely taller than me. Her hair had gone almost fully silver, though I remembered it as the same dark color as mine. She was thin. Not in the way I had made myself thin. Not through choice, but in the way of sustained deprivation. The body doing the mathematics of survival over a very long time with insufficient materials. She moved carefully, the way people move when they are not certain of their balance, or when they have been in small spaces for long enough that open ground feels unreliable. She looked up, and her face did the thing that I had not allowed my face to do in 22 years. It made no calculation, no assessment, no preparation. It simply collapsed inward with the weight of something too large for the muscles available to contain it, and she looked at me the way people look at things they had stopped letting themselves believe still existed, and she said, not loudly, just at the volume of a person speaking to someone standing right in front of them, "Seren." My name. My real name. Said by the only person who had ever known what it carried. I walked to her. She put her arms around me. She was thin, and she was shaking. Or perhaps I was shaking. Or both of us were. The particular trembling of 2 people who have been cold for a very long time, and are only now beginning to understand that warmth might be something they're allowed to have. We stood in the entrance of Veilhorn Hall for a long time. No one disturbed us. I was aware, dimly, that Kyle had positioned himself at a distance that was close enough to ensure safety, and far enough to ensure privacy, and that this particular calibration of distance, close without intruding, was something I was cataloging alongside all the other things I had cataloged about him, the things the stories had failed to mention. When my mother finally pulled back, she held my face in her hands and looked at me with the eyes I had inherited, dark, watchful, reading the room, reading me. "You're thinner than you should be," she said. "I'm working on it," I said. She looked at me a moment longer, reading something in my face that I probably could not have named myself. Then she nodded, the small nod of someone filing something away for later, for when there was more time, and more privacy, and more capacity. "Good," she said. They gave her a room, warmer than my own, with a chair like the one in Cale's chamber. Fenric brought food, more substantial than broth. A proper meal, the kind that acknowledges a person has been hungry for longer than a few months. My mother sat at the table and ate slowly, methodically, without ceremony. The way people eat when they have relearned not to rush nourishment in case it disappears. I sat across from her. I watched her. I tried not to feel the 22 years like a physical object in the room. "You should know," she said between bites, in the particular way of someone who has prepared their first sentences carefully, "that I thought about you every day." "I know," I said. I hadn't known, until this moment, that I had always known. "Your name," she said. "The reason I gave it to you that night. You were old enough to carry it. Old enough to keep it. Keepers begin their education early." She looked at me. "And you were always going to be extraordinary at it. You had the stillness for it." I thought about the 22 years of stillness, about how it had looked, from the outside, like absence, and how it had always felt, from the inside, like containment, like holding something carefully. "I didn't know what I was holding," I said. "No," she said. "But you held it anyway." Later that night, Morsvik's men came. It should have been a surprise. Fenric had suggested there was risk, that moving my mother would alert the people who had held her, that Morsvik would not accept the loss of his leverage without attempting to recover it. I had understood this intellectually. Understanding a thing intellectually and feeling it become real when 6 armed men breach the eastern gate in the dark of night are experiences that occupy very different parts of the body. The alarm went through the hall like a wave, not chaos, but the particular organized urgency of a place that has prepared for exactly this. Guards moved, doors sealed. Kale appeared from nowhere, or from everywhere, in dark clothing, with a knife at his belt, and a quality in his bearing that was entirely different from the man who had offered me broth in the firelit room. This was the Alpha, the ancient one beneath the controlled plainness, the part of him that was made of old decisions and survived conflicts, and the particular ferocity of a wolf who has identified something worth protecting. He crossed to me first, not to the guards, not to assess the breach, to me. "Your mother," he said. "With Fenric," I said. "They sealed the interior corridor." He held my eyes for exactly long enough to confirm I was functional, and in that fraction of a second, something passed between us. Not words, not calculation, but the specific understanding of 2 people who have shared enough honest space to read each other without needing to explain. He nodded. He moved toward the gate. I stood in the corridor, and I was not afraid, or not only afraid. I was something else underneath it. Present. Fully, completely present, in a way that was radically different from the back wall of a ceremony hall, from the corner of a carriage, from every careful act of disappearance I had practiced across 2 decades. I was here. In this hall, belonging to something, or more accurately, someone belonging to me, and me to them, in the fierce and unperformative way that real belonging works when it has been chosen deliberately on both sides. The men outside the gate never got through. It was over in minutes, thorough, professional, without injury on our side. Fenric reported this to me personally because he knew I would want to know before I was told by someone else. Morsvik's men were bound. A message would be sent in the morning. The legal machinery that Kale had been building for 4 years was now complete enough to serve as a proper wall, not just between Morsvik and my mother, but between everything that had been wrong and the beginning of what could now be different. I went back to my mother's room. She was sitting in the warm chair, upright, not asleep. She had heard the alarm and she had remained in the sealed room, and I knew, looking at her face, that she had spent the entire duration doing the mathematics of survival, the calculations of a woman who has had to calculate her way through 22 years of very poor odds. "It's over," I said. She looked at me. She held out her hand. I went and sat beside her, on the floor near the chair, the way I had when I was very small, before any of this. And she put her hand on my hair, and we were quiet together, the way people are quiet when they have been through too much to be anything else, and the fire burned, and outside the mountain wind moved against the stone, and I felt, settling over me like the first warmth after the longest cold, the specific and devastating simplicity of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Chapter 10. Everything the hunger was preparing me for. Spring came slowly to Vialhorn Hall, the way spring comes to mountain places, not all at once, but in careful negotiations with the cold, each warm day advancing a little further than the last before the frost retreated to concede the ground. I was aware of it the way I was becoming aware of many things. Slowly, deliberately, without the anxious monitoring of a person who does not trust good things to last. It was a practice. Like eating properly was a practice. Like sleeping through the night without calculating whether I was taking up too much space in the bed was a practice. Like learning that being seen was not, in fact, the most dangerous thing. That the actual danger had always been in the opposite direction. In the long practice of making yourself so small that the people who might have harmed you could not find you, but neither could the people who might have loved you. My mother spent the first 2 weeks resting. Then she began to talk. She talked to Cale and Fenric and the pack lawyers who came from the capital, with their carefully maintained leather cases of documents and their expressions of professional reverence for a keeper who had survived what she had survived. She talked for hours at a time, working through the stored records with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had kept them alive in her memory through 22 years of difficulty by reviewing them daily, the way you review anything you cannot afford to lose. She talked about pack treaties and territorial boundaries and bloodline agreements that had been legally dormant since her capture, waiting for a keeper to reactivate them by formal declaration. She talked about my father. She was not cruel about it. I want to be clear about that. She was not the kind of woman who had spent 22 years cultivating bitterness. What she had cultivated was something more useful: clarity. She told me, with the precision of a person who has had considerable time to understand a thing, that my father was not a bad man, but a limited one, a man who had chosen comfort over truth at the one moment when the choice mattered permanently, that he had accepted what he was told about her departure because the alternative required a courage he did not have, that he had let me grow up in the atmospheric aftermath of his failure, without, she believed, understanding what he was allowing to happen. "Does that excuse it?" I asked. "No," she said. "But it explains it, and explanation is useful, even when it changes nothing about the damage." I thought about that for a long time. My father sent a letter in the 3rd week, not to my mother, to me. It was the longest piece of writing I had ever received from him, which is to say it was 4 paragraphs, which felt, from him, like an entire confession. He said he had been told the truth, by Fenric, at Kyle's direction, with the particular directness of people who have decided that clarity serves justice better than careful softening. He said he did not know how to apologize for 22 years in a letter. He said he was trying to understand what he had missed, and why. He said in the 4th paragraph, in handwriting that was less steady than usual, "I see now that you learned to disappear, because there was no one making it clear that you should remain. I am sorry that the person who should have done that failed you in the particular way that I did. It was not enough, but it was honest. And I had learned by then that honesty was where repair had to begin, even when the repair was going to take longer than the damage." I showed the letter to Cale. We were in the garden by then, a walled space off the eastern side of the hall, where things grew in the careful way that things grow in mountain soil. Slowly, with deep roots, without extravagance. We had developed a habit of walking there in the late morning, after my mother's sessions with the lawyers, after the day's formal work had been settled into its appropriate channels. We talked in that garden in the way we had learned to talk, directly, without performance, with the particular ease of people who have discovered they can be honest with each other, and have found the discovery so relieving they are not inclined to stop. He read the letter. He handed it back. "Is it enough?" he asked. "No," I said, "but it's real. And I'd rather have something real that isn't enough than something sufficient that isn't true." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the things growing in the mountain soil. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," I said. "The gray dress," he said. "Do you still have it?" I looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to know if you've kept it as a reminder, or if you've kept it because you haven't decided yet." I thought about the gray dress folded at the bottom of the chest in my room. I thought about the back wall of the hall, about the corner of the carriage, about every act of careful, practiced, self-taught disappearance, about the bread crown I had left before it was torn, and the porridge eaten sideways in the kitchen, and the garden in the early mornings, and the library afternoons, and the particular hunger that had carried me all the way to the back of a ceremony hall in a dress the color of ash. "I kept it," I said, "because I thought I might need to disappear again." "And now?" he said. I considered it, properly, with the honesty I was practicing, turning the question over until I could see its underside. The gray dress, the hunger, the 22 years of making myself into something that could survive without being loved. What had all of it made me? Not what I had lost. I knew what I had lost. I could measure it precisely and painfully. But what had it made me? It had made me someone who noticed when people were not fed, who read rooms 3 moves ahead, who could be in a space full of noise and find the single quiet note, who had learned through extreme necessity how to survive on very little, which meant I also knew, better than most, exactly what enough felt like when it finally arrived. I had been hungry for 22 years, which meant I would never again mistake nourishment for something ordinary. I think, I said slowly, that I kept it because I wasn't sure this was real. He looked at me. And now? He said again. I thought about my mother's hand in my hair, about broth in a firelit room, about being pointed at across a hall full of silk and gold by a man who had come looking and found more than he expected, about a letter from Thessaly that said I need to know what I was missing, and the particular gift of being missed by someone who had never known they were looking, about Fenric saying she matches everything, and what it felt like to discover that you had been, all along, the thing that completed a picture you hadn't known existed. Now, I said, I think I'll give the dress away. He said nothing, but he looked at me with those winter lake eyes, and something in them was different, not warmer exactly, but more settled, the way a lake looks when the ice has fully melted and the surface shows the sky. There's something else, he said. There usually is with you, I said. A beat. And then, from him, unexpected, unhurried, with the particular self-consciousness of a man who does not often do things without calculating them first, a small sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. The first I had heard from him, and it was brief and quiet and completely unperformed, and it was more disarming than anything else he had done in all the weeks I had known him. I would like, he said with the careful precision of someone choosing words from a set of several, to continue, whatever this is. I would like it to continue, and I would like it to be chosen. By you, deliberately, with full information. Not because of the keeper records. Not because of your mother. Not because of what happened in the hall. He paused. Because of the conversation in the garden, and the letter from your sister, and the dress at the bottom of the chest. Because of who you actually are, when you're not practicing being nothing. I stood in the mountain garden with the spring light coming over the stone walls, and the things growing slowly in the rocky soil, and I felt the specific, complicated, unprecedented sensation of a life turning. Not dramatically, not with the sharp hinge of a single moment, but with the gradual, trustworthy turning of something that has had enough time and enough honesty to know its own direction. I choose it, I said, not breathlessly, not with the trembling performance of a woman in a story who has been waiting to be saved, with the quietness of someone who has survived enough to know that choosing, really choosing from a position of clarity rather than desperation, is one of the most powerful things a person can do. My mother was alive. The records had been recovered. Morsvik was answering to courts he had spent 22 years avoiding. My father was writing letters in shaky handwriting, learning to see what he had missed. Thessaly had written twice more, the letters changing in tone each time, less sharp, more searching, like a person learning a new language for something they'd always known was there. And I was standing in a garden in mountain soil, choosing to be seen, not by accident, not by a man who happened to point in my direction, not because I'd finally worn the right color, or the right style, or said the right things, but because I had survived everything that had tried to make me disappear, and I had kept the knowledge of what it cost, and I had arrived, thin and shaking, and in a gray dress, at the exact place where all of that survival had been leading. The hunger had cost me. I will not minimize that. The months of careful, quiet, reasonable-seeming self-reduction had cost me in ways that would take longer than one season to repair, not just physically, which was the easiest part, but in the particular internal architecture of a person who has spent too long agreeing that she deserves less. That repair was daily. It was ongoing. It was, Cale had said one morning with his flat directness. Not a destination, but a direction. I had chosen the direction. That, I understood now, was all that had ever been required. Not perfection, not readiness, not having solved all the damage before being allowed to begin again. Just the choosing, specific, eyes open, honest, mine. I looked up at the mountains beyond the stone walls of the garden. Cold peaks, ancient rock, sky the clean, bright blue that only exists at elevation. The same sky that had been there all my life, over my father's house, and the festival tables, and the library afternoons, and the garden mornings. The same sky I had looked at from the corner of the carriage on the way to a ceremony I had not expected to survive. Still there, changed by nothing, ready for whatever came next. Like me. End of story.